Hi, friends, and welcome back to the Girl Camper podcast, where we believe there is no wrong way to camp like a girl. I'm your co-host, Lesa McDermott, and today we are talking all about campgrounds, the heart of every great RV adventure. Whether you love rustic national park campsites or full-service resorts with all of the amenities, one thing is for sure: finding the right campground can make or break your trip. To help us understand what's happening in the world of campgrounds, from the types and trends to what RVers are asking for next, I'm joined by Jeff Crider. Jeff has spent decades covering the RV and outdoor hospitality industry, and he's one of the most knowledgeable voices out there when it comes to campground development, amenities, and the future of camping. We'll also touch base on Jeff's incredible humanitarian work with medical missions across Central and South America. Proof that adventure and compassion, they go hand in hand. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive into what's new and what's next for campgrounds across the country.
What does it mean to camp like a girl?
It means charting your own course.
It means following your passions.
It means building your circle.
Sharing experiences.
And making memories that will last a lifetime.
It means conquering obstacles.
Finding your freedom.
And learning that so much more is out there for you to discover.
So what does it mean to camp like a girl? Well, that's for you to decide.
Because behind every great trip plan is a woman. Start your adventure today at GoRVing.com.
Welcome back, everyone. I am so excited to have today as our guest, Jeff Crider. Did I say that right? Did you say your name right?
Yes,
Jeff?
Crider.
I have kind of known Jeff for several years now because he is a brand ambassador for Go RVing, just like Girl Camper is, but our paths have actually never crossed. So I wanted to have Jeff on because he has been described to me by other people in the industry as a campground savant. Is that about right, Jeff?
Well, I guess.
Anyway, I wanted to have Jeff on to talk about campgrounds and where are they going, what are the different types, just a whole bunch of different things, because I'm kind of always fascinated about logistics and how things get built. And I thought Jeff would be a perfect guest to have on today. So welcome, Jeff, to the Girl Camper podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So, Jeff, I was doing a little dive into your history and your background, and I knew you were, very knowledgeable on campgrounds with your PR business and being a brand ambassador also for Go RVing. But I was really surprised and excited to learn about this other half of Jeff that I had no idea existed. And that would be about some of the stuff that you have done in mission work, and you're outdoorsy. And, so can you share a little bit about your background? And let's start with, how you came involved with campgrounds and the outdoor hospitality industry.
Sure. So I grew up RVing and camping with my parents, and I was the only child. And so my brothers and sisters were really either cousins that we would take with us on these trips or friends that I would bring along. But my stepdad was an endodontist. He's passed away, but he was an endodontist. And to relieve his stress, he got a motorhome. And so I grew up literally working with him to plan trips to different areas. And I always loved the RV trips because that was the time when I had my parents' undivided attention. There were no office calls in those days. This was back in the 70s and early 80s. No office calls, no interruptions. And I got to enjoy the national parks and other scenic places with my parents and with, any cousins that I brought along or friends. And so it was just so cool. I mean, from the time I was literally like about 8 years old until I was in grad school, RVing was the way that I traveled. And it was just such an incredible experience. And so I ended up becoming a newspaper reporter. And I worked at several newspapers in Southern California. And at my last newspaper, which was the Press Enterprise in Riverside County, California, they assigned me to cover RV manufacturing because it turns out that in Riverside, California, and in some of the other cities there, they have a lot of RV manufacturing. And at the time I was there, this was back in the 1990s, it was the second largest RV manufacturing hub in the United States outside of Elkhart, Indiana. Oh, what ended up happening was I started covering the RV industry, and it was kind of a natural fit for me because it's like, hey, I grew up doing this. And so I understood, the manufacturers when I would interview them about different things. And of course, I knew a lot about campgrounds. Well, then what happened was, this was right around the time when my first child was born. My daughter was born. And I was married at the time, and my wife was a stay-at-home mom, and we needed more money. And lo and behold, I got contacted by an editor from RV Business Magazine saying, hey, Jeff, we've seen your work for the Press Enterprise. Would you be interested in freelancing for us? And I said, absolutely. And so I started freelancing for them. And then the company that owned RV Business acquired Woodall's, what was then known as Woodall's Campground Management. And it's now Woodall's Campground Magazine. And so after a few years of doing that, they said, Jeff, we need you to start covering the campground business. And so I was a business reporter, so I started covering the campground business. And I started interviewing campground operators all over the country. And this was really fun for me because, I had grown up RVing and camping. And so it was fun for me to talk to all these different campground owners everywhere. Well, what ended up happening was over time, I started developing a lot of expertise in this industry. And one thing led to another. And then eventually I started, being asked to do PR for some of the companies out there. I started with the park model industry, park model RVs being a type of, factory built unit that you'll see at a lot of campgrounds where people can stay, for a few days or a couple of weeks. And so I started with them, and then some of the state campground industry associations started to hire me and basically write their press releases for them and help raise awareness about independently owned and operated campgrounds. So I started doing that. And, now as I look back, my daughter is 30. And so I started doing this freelancing work right before she was born. And so that's how long I've been working as a writer and publicist for the RV and campground industries. But what happened along with this is sometime after my divorce, friends of mine, I say they coerced me into joining Rotary. I had no idea what Rotary was. But then, once I got involved in a club, then I realized, oh, this is an organization that does good things, lots of humanitarian projects and whatnot. So through that club that I joined, I got connected with this couple that had founded an organization that does medical missions in Central and South America. Well, I happened to be fluent in Spanish, and it was something that I majored in college. I lived in Spain during my junior year, and I had always wanted to do something positive with my Spanish, and this was the opportunity to do that. So I started volunteering, with this organization, and I initially thought I would help them promote their medical missions and, do writing work for them to help them get volunteers and donations and whatnot. Well, they ended up really needing me to do interpreting. And I was just on fire with that experience. I'd never been in the position of using my Spanish in life-saving situations or life-changing situations. I interpreted for surgeons, doctors dealing with emergency situations. It was just an electrifying experience for me. And so this year is actually my 18th year volunteering. Wow. I've been doing this every year. And it's just an incredible, experience. And this is another part of what I do. So I do my writing for the campground industry and the RV industry, but I use some of the proceeds to purchase my airfare so I can travel to Central and South America or the Caribbean and work on these medical missions. And it's just been really an incredible opportunity for me. And it actually even helps me with my public speaking and whatnot, because I do a lot of interviews with the press. And of course, they're not used to seeing a bald white guy speaking Spanish. And so it's fun for me. And I've gotten so that I'm very comfortable, being on camera. I don't freak out about it like I used to at the beginning. And I can just be conversational. And so it's fun.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So your work with the medical missions, has it changed your perspective on travel and community and helping people with purpose through adventure?
Yes. When I was in my college years, I would travel just to see places. Lived in Europe, I would travel to Rome and the other places to see all the famous landmarks and architecture and artwork and whatnot. When you start traveling on a medical mission, you see how you can use your time and your expertise and experience to help others. And when you travel to impoverished areas of the world and you're able to help people as part of a team, it's like doing, well, on a medical mission, 1,000 good deeds. I have zero medical expertise. I have no formal training in that, but I can interpret, and I actually help organize the medical missions now. And so they need me to do that. And so I can enjoy, what they're doing, and I get to see the miracles of what they're doing. I've seen patients, children with cleft lips get the surgeries they need. I've seen so many life-changing situations that have been resolved through the volunteer efforts, of medical professionals. And it has been life-changing for me. And so most of the travel I do out of the country nowadays is on a medical mission, either participating in it or planning one. And I go with other volunteers, who help do this. And it's just an incredible experience. And I just look at our neighbors around the world as basically being our brothers and sisters. We're all humans. We're all just trying to get through each day. That's what I've learned through all my travels. Everybody's just trying to survive and get through the day with as few problems as possible. And if we can go help untangle a few knots, solve a few problems, make people's lives better, that's an incredible feeling. And so I see this as another type of adventure. And, I'm going to be 63 in a couple of days. And when I'm on these medical missions or when I'm planning these trips, I feel like I'm a 20-year-old college student in Spain again. I literally feel like that. And I don't realize that I'm older unless I happen to pass a mirror and say, what happened to the young guy who used to be there? He's not there anymore. But it just sets me on fire. I have so much energy and passion for this. It obviously keeps my Spanish very fluent. And I just derive a lot of great, feeling doing this. And I have people in the campground industry, who help. They contribute funds, to the nonprofit. Nobody gets paid. We're all volunteers, but we do fundraising to raise money to purchase medicines and supplies that we use during the missions, because that's one of the issues in Central and South America. Hospitals have surgeons that can do surgeries, but they require the patients to pay for all the supplies that are needed. And that becomes a stumbling block because oftentimes, if you're poor, you don't have money to buy surgical supplies. And so the surgery doesn't get done. And oftentimes what we do is we do surgeries to repair, orthopedic problems or facial deformities and things like that. It's not to make people pretty, it's to make people employable, because there's a lot of discrimination, unfortunately, in the world. And when you're able to solve somebody's, facial deformity, then they're able to go out and get hired someplace. And sometimes, we've had cleft lip patients in their 40s who've never had a date before. So we're able to, affect their lives in that way as well. And it's just a really, really uplifting experience. So I see all of this travel as being adventure, and sometimes adventure with a humanitarian purpose. And that's really cool as well.
That is cool. I can so relate to that. And I think that is a neat thing that you're doing. And yeah, hopefully from this podcast, some people will be interested in this and you know, start doing the same thing.
Yeah, and I would encourage people do it now. Don't wait. Why wait?
Exactly. Don't wait. Don't wait. Go do it now because you never know when something's going to happen and you're not going to be able to.
Right. You need your health to be able to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that my stepdad always told me from when I was really little. He said, don't wait until you're old to travel.
Yep.
Travel when you're young. He
So
said,
true.
you want to be able to get to the highest step. You want to be able to go see everything. And I mean, even the scenery behind you, to hike to that kind of area, you have to be in decent shape. It's something that you need to do when you're younger, unless you keep yourself in really good shape.
Yeah.
But I find that so many people don't do that. They postpone things. And it's all going to be at some point in the future, I'll consider doing that. And they really need to do it now.
Yep. Live your life with no regrets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
So let's switch gears here now and talk about what the podcast is supposed to be about today, and that is campgrounds in the campground industry. What do you think the overall state of campgrounds is in the United States right now? And are there enough sites to meet the demands for RV and campers?
Okay, so there's a couple of aspects to that question. The good news is there are more campgrounds with better amenities than there have ever been in this country. The pandemic, as you know, created such incredible demand for camping and RVing across the country. That was like a lightning bolt hitting the industry. And all across the country, developers and existing campground owners started pouring as much money as they could into improving the available campgrounds and RV parks and resorts around the country. That level of activity has subsided a bit because we don't have the whole world trying to go camping right now like we did during the COVID-19 pandemic, when camping was really like the only permissible option, that was allowed in a lot of jurisdictions, get out into the outdoors. And so the other question that you ask, is there enough capacity? And this is something that I've wrestled with over the years, and I've had several people in the industry explain to me, the different issues with this. Generally speaking, there's enough capacity. The challenge, though, is that if you want to go camping to a really popular destination in the middle of summer, you're going to need to make a reservation, because the industry cannot build so much capacity to enable the whole world to go camping on the same weekend, and then also be able to maintain that site empty the rest of the year. That's the issue. It's because the developers of campgrounds and the owners of campgrounds look at the number of sites they provide, from an economic perspective. They have to be able to support their business on a year-round basis. It can't be just 4th of July weekend. And so some people may complain, well, I can't get into this campground, in the month of July because everything is busy. Well, if you go back to that same campground in October, you could probably find a site with no problem. And maybe if you went in April, you could get in there without any issue. It's all supply and demand. And so, yes, there's more capacity than ever, but it doesn't mean that you won't encounter campgrounds that are booked solid, at popular travel times during the year. What it does mean, though, and I think because we have more people who are RVing and traveling now than before, is you need to do more proactive planning. You need to make reservations. You need to start your planning earlier. I've written articles for AAA over the years, and I used to tell my editor at one of the publications, we really should do these camping stories in January or February instead of June. Because I told her that, if you have this great camping story coming out in June, people will get inspired. But the problem is a lot of the best campgrounds are already booked at that time because they should have made the reservation back in January or February.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I didn't win that battle, but I've been proven right regardless. And so you just have to look at things with more planning in mind. Yes, you can still be spontaneous. You can still, drive and camp places randomly. There are places you can go to, that are harder to find that you can camp in, that aren't as well publicized, when you get campsites there. But the reality is we have more people now who want to enjoy the outdoors. When I grew up in California in the 70s and 80s, I would go to Yosemite usually twice a year with my parents. Well, I remember when I was 18 hiking to the top of Half Dome. I did it with one of my cousins. And there were maybe 15 people, including us, on top of Half Dome when we did it in the month of June. Nowadays, you have to get a permit to go up for the day. And you may have seen pictures where they'll have hundreds of people on Half Dome.
Yeah.
Well, the trail was deserted when my cousin and I did it. And we did it in June, one of the busiest months of the year. And it was a lonely day. We hardly saw anybody all day long. So there's just vastly more people out enjoying the outdoors now than there used to be. And so there's great places to go. You just have to plan a little bit more. So, obviously, people who want to go certain places will wish that there were more campsites available. But, the campgrounds are doing as much as they can. If they could afford to put in more sites, they would. Because they have to look at this from a year-round perspective. Can they generate enough business to justify those additional sites year-round or for however long they're open? This was something that I had a hard time understanding when I started complaining to people myself about this a few years ago. And they explained to me, well, Jeff, we have to support this business year-round, not just on these few weekends. And that's kind of the reality that campground operators face. Now, granted, there are different types of campgrounds. You can go into government-run campgrounds, which are typically bare bones campgrounds. Usually they have some of the best real estate in the country, but they'll have far fewer amenities, than independently owned and operated campgrounds. So they're far less likely to have Wi-Fi, less likely to have swimming pools and other things like that.
Even the hookups,
Even the hookups, it's so, you'll get better amenities at an independently owned and operated campground. But, in state and national parks, you've got some of the prettiest places in the country, so people want to be there. But, the challenge, though, if you want to go someplace that's popular, they may make you go to a website to make a reservation. And there have been times here in California, well, even growing up with my, as I was raising my own kids, I was never able to get into a couple of state parks in the Big Sur area of California. And I tried and tried and tried. I could never get a reservation because they were always sold out.
Yep.
Now, I didn't give up, though. I found independently owned and operated campgrounds nearby. And we were able to get campsites there. And then we were able to visit those state parks that were so popular during the day. We just didn't spend the night there, but we were a few miles away at a beautiful campground. So we still had the experience. And that's something else that people need to keep in mind, when they make reservations and they want to go to a popular place like Yellowstone or the Great Smokies or Yosemite or someplace like that that's really popular. If they go on the websites and find that, well, everything's booked, there are independently owned and operated campgrounds just outside most national parks and state parks. And so you can make reservations at those places, which are more likely to have space, and use them as base camps to go in and visit the national parks or state parks during the day. And that's something I recommend that people do. Of course, there's different kinds of campgrounds, different types of amenities that they have. Independently owned and operated campgrounds, I think, are one of the last family-owned businesses in this country, aside from maybe restaurants, where you can even have multiple generations of the same family owning and operating the business. There's a lot of campgrounds like this in the Midwest in particular, but they're all over the country. Some of these campgrounds are 50 and 60 years old. There's a campground in Maine that is a little over 100 years old, and it's still run by the same family that started it. Yeah, back in the early 1920s. And It's neat when you go into these family-owned campgrounds because you get that personal touch. It's not like you're dealing with some corporation, someplace, you're dealing with people just like you would if you went to a family-owned restaurant in a town near you. There's some accountability there. There's contact. There's people that make friends with the owners of campgrounds and see them every year and they develop memories together and whatnot. Um, so there's lots of variety out there. Just depends on what kind of experience, you want to have. One of the questions that I get sometimes from media outlets is, what's the best campground? And I kind of rephrase that because it really depends on what you're looking for.
Yeah.
For some people, the best campground could be a really beautiful campsite. Well, for me, Jenny Lake Campground in the Grand Tetons is one of my favorites.
That is a
It's
nice.
just a very, very basic campground, just a parking space and, an outhouse,
Mhm.
I mean, just very, very basic, but it's some of the most spectacular scenery you'll see anywhere in this country. Now, if you're a young parent and you've got young kids and you want to keep them entertained, there's lots of campgrounds that have really fun activities for them. And this is something that I didn't really experience growing up in California because we usually went to, state or national parks. And in those days, there just weren't that many activities, really, campgrounds that we stayed at. Well, in recent decades, activities and entertainment are really key at campgrounds, and that's really something that differentiates one type of campground from another. I mean, lots of campgrounds like KOAs, for example, will have tie-dye t-shirt activities, for families to do on weekends. They'll have arts and crafts and things like that. If you go to some of the Jellystone Park locations around the country, your kids can see Yogi Bear and Ranger Smith and Cindy Bear. And the Jellystones have distinguished themselves by offering some of the best water amenities in the country. They've got just these really incredible activities for kids to do. That doesn't mean that they're the only ones who do this. There are other independently owned and operated campgrounds that have these attractions that are called Wibbits, which are kind of like floating trampolines and climbing structures that are campgrounds set up on ponds. And my only regret is that I didn't get to do that when I was growing up. These days get to do this. The other thing now, since we're in October, I mentioned activities, pre-Halloween activities.
Oh, yeah.
So many campgrounds nowadays, independently owned and operated campgrounds, will have trick-or-treating through the campground. They'll have costume contests. They'll have campsite decorating contests. I'd never seen anything like that when I was growing up. But in many areas of the country, this is really popular now. And some campgrounds are seeing so much demand for this kind of activity that they'll have 3, 4, 5, 6, sometimes even 7 pre-Halloween themed weekends.
Oh.
And they tell me that these are some of the busiest weekends they have of the whole year. And this is during the shoulder season, in September and October. And, when you think back on it, imagine how much fun for a kid. I mean, when I was growing up, Halloween was once during the year. It was for a few hours and that was it. You're done. Well, nowadays, kids can literally experience Halloween multiple times during the year if they want by going to campgrounds and engaging in these activities. So it's really fun. And then for those who aren't looking for Halloween in particular, there's fall activities, there's scarecrow making contests. Lots of campgrounds will have baking activities, bobbing for apples, things like that. Sometimes they'll have pumpkin carving contests as well. There's just so much more for families to do. We didn't have this nearly to this extent when I was growing up. Now, granted, if I had been growing up in the Midwest as opposed to Southern California, the situation would have been different. Because in the Midwest, you have so many more campgrounds that are family owned and operated, where the campground owners offer these kinds of activities. And you can find these kinds of activities in the, the Northeast, really all over the country. but more so in the Midwest and in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states.
Hmm.
And it's just really a cool experience. And of course, the other thing though, for camping, I've talked a lot about, what to do with kids, but when you get older folks like quiet campgrounds and they like adult activities. And there's some really posh RV resorts around the country now where you can go in and there's golf courses, 18 or 24 hole golf courses, or they'll have really ritzy potlucks and happy hours and things like that. They'll have dancing. I did an article for Go RVing a year or so ago on RV resorts that offer dance classes and dance activities. And that's just something that's really cool. I love dancing. I'm actually into salsa dancing myself. That's kind of an growth of my medical mission activity. So I pay attention to the dancing now. And it's just really cool to see this at RV resorts. And, when I was growing up traveling with my parents, this may have been a function of them taking me certain places, but I don't ever remember seeing a campground where there was dancing. But
No.
they offer this now all over the country. And, during the summer, there's campgrounds that will have like teen dances. So,
Right.
That's really cool, you know. And over the years, I've written stories about young campers who fall in love with each other at campgrounds and then they end up getting married, later. And it kind of depends on the frequency with which you visit a campground. One thing that isn't talked about as much is seasonal camping. And that's, of course, when people rent a campsite for the whole camping season and they
Right.
leave their RV at the campground and just drive to it on weekends or whenever they have free time. And the people who do this really create incredible memories for their kids. And I have lake envy because I'm in Southern California and we don't have any water. And so I always enjoy writing about campgrounds in the Midwest or in the East that have all this water. Send that water out west. We could use it here. But they have these great activities that they can do in a campground by the lake, swimming, fishing, kayaking, paddle boats, so many things you can do in the water. And, I think it's great for people who are able to not only do that on a weekend, but be able to do that all summer. And so
Right.
when I write these articles for the industry, to some extent, I'm living vicariously through the families that camp in these other places because they're having experiences that I didn't get to have growing up. And so I write with a certain bit of envy. So my passion is not just because I have passion for the industry, but it's because really I envy what they're doing and wish I would have had that chance growing up. And so I'm always happy to see people who are doing camping, who are engaging in RVing, because really I can't think of anything else that gives you this kind of chance for family bonding and for sharing these incredible experiences, whether you want to just, engage in water attractions at a campground or go hiking, in the woods or go, to a beach somewhere, go fishing, whatever you want to do, rock climbing. I took my daughter when she was about 14 to Joshua Tree National Park. She went through a phase where she said she wanted to learn how to do rock climbing. So I said, okay. So I signed us up for a rock climbing class. And the good news and bad news with that, the good news is that cured her of her interest in rock climbing. She got about 40 feet off the ground and she said, Dad, I've had enough. And she's never done that again.
Oh, funny.
And it's just neat, though, being able
Mhm.
to do these kinds of things and have these experiences, and you really test your limits. There is a KOA campground, the Ventura Ranch KOA, that I visited a few weeks ago with my kids and my grandson, and they actually have 12 station zip line and ropes course. And they use that not only for their guests, but they have been interacting with rehab centers, and they have some of their mental health patients who are battling depression and anxiety and whatnot, and they use the equipment to, build self-confidence and teamwork and whatnot. And so there's so many benefits that can come from visiting campgrounds and checking out the equipment, that they have. It just really depends on what your focus is. So as I was mentioning earlier, what's the best campground? Well, it really depends on what you want to do.
Yeah.
Love writing about the campground stories, the owners. Oh, over the years, I've gotten to know people all over the country. And that's kind of how I've developed expertise, because writing press releases for the campground associations in different states, I've written about the award-winning campgrounds. So I've learned about the best campgrounds in the country. And I remember a few years ago, I did a trip to the Northeast. I had a conference where I was invited to speak in Connecticut, and it was at the end of September. And I thought, end of September in Connecticut. So I got there a week in advance, and I drove all through New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine because I wanted to see the fall colors. It was a little early that year, but one of the other things that I wanted to see besides the fall color was the campgrounds, the award-winning campgrounds that I had been writing about. And I wanted to find out, are these campgrounds really, truly award winners?
Mm.
Or are these campgrounds that got awards because somebody knew somebody?
Right.
Was really happy to find out as I visited these campgrounds that the award-winning campgrounds were clearly the best of class. And so I was like relieved, yes, relieved, that they were excellent. They were really excellent. They were clean. And so that's something else people need to keep in mind is, look at campground ratings.
Yeah.
People are very forthcoming these days, with their opinions. And you can find campgrounds. And if you're going into an area you're not familiar with, you can check the reviews and see. And you can read the reviews and discern if somebody was in a bad mood or if it's a real honest opinion. You can check that and see. But
Well, I think when you see multiple reviews saying the same thing,
right.
Not
Yeah.
rude staff, if you see that over and over again, then, that's likely one to avoid.
Yeah, it validates.
Yeah.
Validates what they're saying. But the great thing now is we're at a good time in the camping history of this country because there's more options, greater range of amenities than we've ever had before. And a lot of the campgrounds that are independently owned and operated, they're small businesses. And so, the owners will invest in improvements as they can. And I know from having covered the industry that they're constantly doing that because they face competition. And that's something that exists now that didn't exist many years ago when I was growing up camping with my parents, is competition. If you have a campground that isn't up to snuff, people aren't going to want to go there. And they're not going to be as busy as a campground that is super clean and that has all kinds of activities and amenities for people to engage in. People are fussier nowadays. And they demand all of these extras and they want to be entertained. And that's something that hasn't subsided. More and more campgrounds are offering activities of one sort or another. And really, you need to do research to figure out where you want to go and what kinds of things you want to do. And a lot of this information is on their websites. So people can go, they can go to GoRVing.com and check out some of the blogs, the travel blogs that I've written, and they can click on the links of campgrounds that are referenced there. There's many other writers that they use that write about their experiences and they have their own recommendations. Click on the campground links and do research. They'll often have their activity schedules for the year. It's getting late in the year now, but as we get into like January, February, that's the time of year when a lot of campgrounds will post their activities for 2026. And that's a good way to start planning, what do you want to do that year? Where are you going to take the kids? What part of the country do you want to visit? And it just really helps to plan and be aware of what the opportunities are.
Makes a lot of sense, and RVers they're starting to want more than just hookups, unless that, they are fully aware of where they just booked a site at a federal campground is probably not going to have hookups. But if they're looking at more of the resort type campground or the destinations or those type of things, what are the most in-demand amenities are you seeing owners actually add?
You know, I hear from the park operators that tell me, and they've been telling me this for the last few years, that strong Wi-Fi is even in higher demand than a swimming pool. And that's because
Mm,
there's so many people who need it for their work. Because a lot of people nowadays, the reality is we're all kind of held hostage to our employers, and they expect us to be accessible even on weekends. And for people to get away, they need to be able to maintain contact with, their employers. And if they have, Zoom calls they have to do, presentations they need to finish, research they have to do, they need a strong Wi-Fi connection to be able to do that. And so I'm hearing from my contacts in the campground and RV industry that there are more and more RVers that are selecting where they're going to camp based on which park has better Wi-Fi.
mm,
So that is a huge consideration for some. Um, Others, of course, will want to have room for their slide outs and they'll want to have, 50 amp connections. But I think that the Wi-Fi has become so important. I mean, even for people who are retired, a lot of people want to watch TV and they want to,
yeah.
you know, use Wi-Fi to watch TV and I know for some of the campground operators, it's more affordable in the long run if they provide a stronger Wi-Fi signal than if they subscribe to a cable television provider.
Right.
And
Right.
so because it's very costly to dig up all of those utilities across the campground, that's something else that campgrounds have to be aware of when they do dig up their utility lines is they have to figure out what else should we put in
Hmm.
while we have these trenches open and
Right.
maybe try to look into the future and figure out what are people going to want. But
Yeah.
that's certainly something, that they need, that people want.
I know for me, having good Wi-Fi is super important. And I just finally broke down and bought a Starlink Mini because they finally went on sale. Um, because yeah, I my boss, Janine Pettit, always needs to get a hold of me.
Right.
So yeah, that is really critical. And where I live here in the Black Hills, we have a lot of dead zones. So
Right.
um, Wi-Fi either isn't there or service isn't there. So I'm excited to be able to try out the Starlink, which sometime to see how that really improves what I can do. And then will hopefully let me go camping more. Because there's been a lot of weekends this year where I'm like, oh, I'd like to go to Dalton Lake or somewhere in Custer State Park, but I know there's no cell service there. Therefore, I'm not going to be connected. Um, yeah. So
I know during the pandemic, there were people that I interviewed who used Starlink and they were very happy with it because they could get access when they were in remote areas and then they could stay in remote areas and
yeah.
keep up with their work. And that's really important for people because so many people are mobile now, um,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't want to go back to an office. And it's just having that connection so that no matter where you are, if you want to escape for the weekend somewhere, you can still do, an assignment that you have to do.
Yeah.
Me as a writer, I mean, I've always written early in the morning. I'm a morning person, so I'm up early. And I like having that Wi-Fi connection so I can get on and take care of business early in the day and get things taken care of and then have the rest of the day free, to do
Yep.
whatever I want to do.
Makes sense. So do you see campgrounds adapting to trends like sustainability, solar power, recycling, EV charging? I imagine
So
that's going to be
yeah,
something.
so that's taking place to varying degrees across the country. In a lot of campgrounds now, I'm seeing recycle bins,
Mm,
and they encourage people to, sort their trash. And so if you've got bottles or whatever, you can probably find a receptacle at the campground to get rid of your bottles and aluminum cans and things like that. If you have paper trash, things like that. There are campgrounds that have solar power. I've written about several of them that do. And depending on where you are in the country, it can be financially advantageous to do that. EV charging, I think I've identified about 100 campgrounds across the country that offer EV charging. And
it's not very many.
It's
then.
not very many when you consider, but the country has had kind of a stop and start approach, to EV, depending on where you are and which administration is in power, and so people are going back and forth, with this. I know that some of the campgrounds have used grant funding to get their EV charging stations in place.
Hmm.
I also know that campgrounds are wanting to discourage people from trying to charge, their electric vehicles using the pedestals because it can fry the pedestals and start fires, depending
Oh,
on what kinds of equipment they're using.
huh.
And so it's always best for people to check with the campground that they're staying at before they try to do any vehicle charging, because they have to have the proper equipment to be able to do that. But as far as I know, right now, I'm not seeing a big rush to install EV chargers just because of where we're at, politically in the country right now. It's just not as strong of a push as it was a few years ago.
Right.
But I think though that if at some point in the future, the government starts encouraging more EV charging, I'm sure the campgrounds will respond accordingly. The campgrounds just want to be careful with their investments, and they want to be mindful of what's really needed. And so if they have a certain amount of money to invest, I know a lot of them would rather invest in better Wi-Fi than in an EV connection because they see that as a hotter fire. Because the more complaints they can take care of and the more need they can take care of, with whatever discretionary money they have, the better. And I know the Wi-Fi is top of the list because the expectations are so much different now. Even when we first started seeing internet access in campgrounds, back in the early days, like back around the year 2000, and I wrote about this just as it was starting. We had dial-up modems in campgrounds, and people used to have to go to the front desk of the campground and hook up their computer, to a dial-up modem. And then eventually they were able to sit, outside at a picnic table. And then eventually they got better hotspots and they could sit further away. And, the technology has evolved since then, but the demand has evolved as well.
Right.
Used to be people didn't demand to have that kind of access, but now they do. And if you don't have Wi-Fi, you basically have to let people know on your website or when they call, we don't have Wi-Fi, by the way. And that is a good thing also, because I have interviewed campground owners who take pride in the fact that they're in a remote location and they can't really get Wi-Fi. And they tell people, relax, pretend it's 1992 or whatever, talk to the person next to you. So that's like one of the hottest trends I'm seeing.
Yeah, I could see that. And I suppose part of it with the EV charging is there's not a lot of EV vehicles that can tow right now. So maybe when you start to see that shift where, more vehicles, more tow vehicles are EV, you'll start to see more charging stations for them, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think it'll just depend on what happens. The campground operators are a savvy group and they're watching the headlines and obviously what's happening in their respective states. And so as they see, new edicts, being delivered and new mandates for one thing or another, they'll respond. But I don't see them getting too far ahead on this simply because there's so much uncertainty right now about where the country really stands on this. Some parts of the country, are very green and other parts are not. And that's just the reality of the United States right now.
Yeah.
And so I do know that campground operators will tell me that they receive positive feedback from any green initiatives that they do. One of the other green things that they do is more and more campgrounds are going toward electronic check-in, and they're putting more of their activity schedules on apps. I know the Jellystone Park network in particular is doing this, and they save a lot of paper.
Yeah.
because they're not having to print so many activity schedules. Other parks are doing this as well, and they're trying to cut down on paper waste. Because if you have an activity schedule and it's only good for a particular weekend, well, that's a lot of paper.
That's a lot of paper.
Because you could have, say, a lot of campgrounds are 200, 300 sites, even 150 sites. Well, that's a lot of paper to be going through every single weekend. And so, more campgrounds are starting to offer the electronic versions instead. And that's another thing that's a little less noticeable, but it still is environmentally friendly because it's saving paper. And of course, a lot of other campgrounds are trying to save water and electricity. They have, low flow devices in the bathrooms. Some of them will have timers on the showers. It kind of depends, on what their experiences have been with guests. I've heard horror stories, over the years about, people leaving the water running and things like that. And
Yeah.
campground owners get upset about that kind of thing. So, they'll install whatever they think is appropriate, to be environmentally friendly in their areas. But definitely in terms of trash pickup, a lot of campgrounds are very concerned about that and are trying to offer their guests ways to sort and dispose of their waste, in appropriate.
I love that. We just camped at the Game Lodge campground in Custer State Park a couple weeks ago. And this kind of hits two things that you've already talked about is planning way in advance to get a site. As a local, most of the campgrounds in Custer State Park are booked a year in advance. And it's hard for us to ever spur of the moment get to go camp there. And a couple weekends ago, lo and behold, there were 2 sites that were still available in all of Custer State Park. And I'm like, let's go to the Game Lodge. We've never camped there. And it was very fun. Enjoyed that a lot. But I was pleasantly surprised to see a recycling bin next to the big trash compactors for cans and stuff. And I was like, good job, guys. Good job.
Yeah, it's nice. I mean, we're trained to do this at home.
Mm-hmm.
Got 3 waste receptacles, 1 green, 1 blue, and 1 gray. And that's just the way it's been for, a few years. So people are used to doing this. And so it almost makes you feel guilty if you throw something away.
Yeah.
I certainly feel that way. If I really hate to throw a bottle into a regular trash can, I'd rather throw it into a recycle bin.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people feel this way as well.
Yeah. So what do you think the next 5 to 10 years look like for the camping industry?
I think that the campground industry is going to continue to be very busy. The reality is there's nothing that competes with the great outdoors.
Mhm.
Just like the scenery that you have behind you. I mean, what a great place to take kids, family, and even for your own health. So much of our own mental health improves when we're able to take walks in nature, to hear the birds, to see squirrels racing up trees. It's just so neat to be able to experience that. And it helps us escape the stress, of our daily lives, of our routines. And I think that that's not going to go away. I think that there's always going to be a desire for camping and experiencing nature. And I think that campgrounds are going to continue to work to improve what they have. I think that they're going to continue to take whatever money they have, whatever net profit they have, and reinvest it into their campgrounds. Because that's what they have to do to be competitive. And people's expectations are not declining. They keep increasing. And that puts pressure on campgrounds to get better. And so I think, as we move forward, we will see more and more, good and great campgrounds and fewer campgrounds that are not so great. Because the ones that are not so great, what ends up happening is they get acquired by investors who want to make them what they should be. Even because there's fixer-uppers out there. And I've been turnaround stories for years, and it's fun for me to write about a campground that was a disaster that got new owners who came in and they got everything fixed. And now there's families going there with, kids and they're having fun, and then, the adjoining town is happy because now it's not an eyesore, it's a great place to go camping.
Mm.
The other thing that people don't realize is that the campground industry is really a segment of the travel industry.
Mm.
And we're overshadowed by the hotel industry because of the size of the hotel industry. But campgrounds provide economic support to their communities. I mean, when you look at, Florida and the other Sunbelt states, they provide a huge amount of revenue to the cities. All the snowbirds that go to those places in winter, in Texas, the winter Texans, and Arizona, California, all the snowbirds that come to these places in winter are going out to dinner. They're buying fuel. They're going to museums. They're spending their money in activities, and they're supporting the economies of these different cities and towns all across the country. And I think campgrounds are going to continue to do that. RV parks and resorts are going to continue to do that. Even though they're not seen as this big economic engine, they really are, because they're an important part of the travel and tourism segment. And I think that the industry is just going to continue to get better because it has to, because our expectations keep rising. And the other thing that happens is once you've been to a really good campground, you're going to want to go to another really good campground and another really good campground and another really good campground. And so then you're going to keep looking for those really great places to visit, because you're not going to want to go to a place that doesn't deliver a really good experience for you.
Right.
And so that in turn will put pressure on the owners to keep stepping up their game, the campground owners to keep stepping up their game. And that's what happens. And that's what I write about for Woodall's Campground Magazine. And really for other publications in the campground industry, I write about improvements that they're doing. It's a positive business story, but it is good business strategy as well, because you're not going to attract campers if you don't have a great place for people to go. You've got to keep stepping up, your game. And I see that continuing, so really, as I look to the future, the economy is not as strong as it was now, or excuse me, not as strong as it was, a few years ago in terms of demand. But I don't see the investment strategy changing, because the business interest of campground owners is to improve their product so they can get more people, more guests. And that's not going to change. And people's expectations of having great experiences camping are going to continue to increase. Probably in another 10 years, there's going to be something else I'll be writing about that I'm not writing about now that will be a new priority. We're seeing more, involving glamping. We're seeing more campgrounds starting to offer, better food options.
Yeah.
Some campgrounds have bistros on site. Some have designer coffees, espressos, and things like that. There was no espresso anywhere I camped growing up. That did not exist. But now, I mean, I could actually sit down and write down names of a few places where you can get, high-end coffees and things, Some campgrounds have wine bars and beer bars,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this stuff did not exist decades ago. And, the other thing is food trucks. Some campgrounds, they can't really, develop their own kitchen, but they can call a food truck or different food trucks to come in offering different specialties. And that works really well, and they're really popular, with people.
Yeah.
And
We've seen that where the mini donut food truck would come in, or the ice cream truck would come in, and that was at a full service Camp Margaritaville that
right.
they would do that, and that was fun.
Yeah. There's a company that makes equipment for campground owners to make miniature donuts. I can't remember their name offhand. They were at a trade show that I attended a couple of years ago, and they had these t-shirts that said, "Abs are great, but have you tried donuts?" I thought that was hilarious.
That one is good.
Yeah.
That's good. So, for someone who is dreaming about owning or developing a campground, what advice would you give them based on what you're seeing in the market today?
Well, the good news is there are consultants out there to advise you. So I would not go in just based on assumptions. I would do your homework. Woodall's Campground Magazine is an excellent publication. Their website is woodallscm.com.
Mm.
You can get on that website and you can run keyword searches. You could look for consultant, for example, and then you can pull up the names of consultants that specialize in the campground industry. You need to have a business plan. You need to understand the market. There are couples and families that are still getting into the campground business. It's more expensive now than it used to be, but there are still couples and families that are doing it. I mean, I've written about some of them even in recent years, the last couple of years, that are doing it. And it's really cool to see because this is an opportunity for entrepreneurship. A campground offers opportunities to develop many different types of skill sets because you not only need, construction, but you need a marketing background, you need an accounting background, and you have to have different people who can fill those different needs. And so it's an opportunity to develop those different skill sets. To get financing, to build a campground, for example, or to fix up an existing campground, you have to have a business plan. And the majority of the lenders out there do not have experience dealing with campgrounds. There are lenders that do have experience dealing with campgrounds. And so regardless, though, you still have to be able to convince them that you have a viable project. That's where a consultant can help you. And these consultants can, work through the numbers. They can look at the size of the campground you're planning or the one that you're wanting to improve and see what kind of amenities are needed, what kinds of improvements are needed, how much all of this is going to cost, and how much you'll need to charge per site or per accommodation to be able to make the money work. And based on those calculations, they'll be able to figure out, will you be competitive? And is this viable? And those are things you need to know up front to be able to get the financing in place and also to be able to have a timeline and know what you're doing. And oftentimes the consultants will, develop plans to help you develop or improve a campground in phases. So you don't do everything all at once. You do a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And a lot of campgrounds, new campgrounds, they'll have, say they have 20 acres of land or 15 acres of land or 10 acres or whatever the number is. They won't develop all of that all at once. They'll start small and then they'll go based on demand. And sometimes they'll change their plans or alter the plans a little bit based on what reality is or becomes. And the other thing that campground operators do, and this is again looking toward the future, is they survey their guests. The really savvy campground operators conduct surveys and they ask their guests, what do you want? What should we be doing better? What would you like to see more of? What would you like to see that we don't have? Those kinds of questions, because sometimes campground owners, husbands and wives, for example, will have different priorities on what needs to be done. What's the next improvement? We've got $100,000. What should we spend it on? Well, there's a disagreement sometimes between husbands and wives over how that money should be spent. Those are ultimately decided by surveys. Well, let's ask the guests and see what they say. Well, that's the reality. And the smart business operators respond to what the guests want, the consumers, because they're the customer and you got to take care of them. And sometimes, that certain improvement that one of the owners wanted to do gets postponed because something else is more urgent in the mind of the guest. That's ultimately what the campgrounds are trying to do. is they're offering activities and amenities because they want to appeal to guests and they want to be competitive with their peers down the street or down the road. And that's what they have to do to survive and be viable. And they can't be stagnant, because those that are stagnant ultimately lose to the competition that does something else that's more innovative. And that's something that has surprised me about this industry, because I remember even a decade or 15 years ago thinking, gosh, what am I going to write about next year? I've already written about everything. Things keep changing and the demands keep changing. That's something I didn't realize years ago. The demands keep changing. I literally thought I was going to run out of things to write about and I'll be done. That's it. I've written all that could be written. Nope. It keeps changing. The world keeps changing. And even as you mentioned earlier, what's going to happen with demand for EV charging? That's another story unto itself. And that's going to evolve over time, and we'll just have to see what happens. But in the meantime, people need to be careful and don't secretly charge your vehicle without talking to the front desk first to see what they recommend, because you don't want to start any fires anywhere, with the pedestals. And I've heard this actually from a park owner in the Black Hills area who was really worried about somebody charging his vehicle and setting some of the trees on fire, in the area. And so there's safety considerations, as well, that factor into things.
Right, right. So before we wrap up here, Jeff, you've traveled extensively and worked, all around the world. What's one experience from your travels or your humanitarian work that still inspires you today?
Well, the humanitarian work that I do is endlessly inspiring, and it's endlessly inspiring because I get to see American doctors doing their best to help others who can't possibly help themselves because of their poverty. And there's really no single experience I've had, because I have these kinds of experiences on every medical mission. And so I'm constantly re-energized by what they do. We're planning another mission next year to Ecuador, and then the following year we'll be in Panama. And I'm just endlessly motivated and inspired by all of this. Our group is called Med Access International. It's medaccessintl.org. That's our website.
Mm.
And, we're one of many groups that do this kind of work. I mean, there's lots of organizations. Doctors Without Borders is another organization, but Doctors Without Borders, the last I heard, was requiring people to volunteer for 6 months. Well, most people can't do that unless they're a student or retired.
Right.
And our missions are only 1 week, 7 days. So it's much easier for people of all ages to volunteer with us to do this kind of work. And I just love the travel that's involved in helping people, meeting people from different countries, and of course, using my Spanish, for a positive purpose. I love talking to reporters in different countries, doing, interviews in Spanish and whatnot. And just letting everybody know, we're all human. We're all trying to get through each day, and let's make the best of it. And there's so many adventures I see yet in my own future. And as I look further down the road in my grandson's future, because I want to take him, that's my goal. I've taken both of my kids with me on medical missions. And so my next, milestone is going to be to get my grandson with me, but he's only 5. And so I think I've got at least another 10 years
Yeah.
before I can get him with me. And then I will have had 3 generations that have done medical mission work.
That's fantastic. That is absolutely fantastic. Where can listeners or viewers follow your work and learn more about the books that you've written? And you mentioned the website already for Med Access International. We'll put a link in the show notes to it, but where can they find out more about you?
Well, my LinkedIn profile, has a lot of my background, and it has links to some of my books that you can read, online for free. A lot of the writing that I do, and I haven't even really talked about this because I do other things. I've consulted for water agencies for many years as well. Literally about half of my work has been with the campground industry, and the other half has been with cities and water agencies. And my water agency work kind of morphed into history book writing about maybe 12 years ago. And what I do is I write books that basically talk about the economic growth of different areas and how water agencies helped support that growth and development. And so some of those books, you can find links on my LinkedIn site.
Okay.
And, another, of course, big portion of my writing is on the Woodall's website, woodallscm.com for Woodall's Campground Magazine. And then, of course, Go RVing is another one. And I've written many travel blogs for them as well. And occasionally I'll write for other publications and try to write inspiring stories to get people out exploring what there is to see, whether it's here or overseas. And of course, if you're going to travel here in the US or in Canada, it's great to be RVing. That's a great way to spend quality time with friends and family. And as I mentioned earlier, my best memories growing up are of the RV trips I took with my own parents. And so in a way, I see my writing work for the campground industry and the RV industry as giving back. It's giving back that love and joy that I experienced growing up and using that writing to kind of inspire others to give it a try or to try new things if they're already doing it. And, the resources we have now are so much greater than they were years ago. We have the internet now. When I was growing up, there was no internet. And so the only research tools we had were AAA guides and
Right.
maps. That was it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, unless you went to a bookstore and found something that inspired you, that was it. And so you didn't have the ability to cover so much ground so quickly in terms of research. And now we have all of these tools, but the reality is, so does everybody else. So you have to plan more depending on where you want to go. But I think that we have the resources available for everyone to really plan incredible trips. And that's something I certainly enjoy doing. I mean, it was hard for me to leave the newspaper world back in the 1990s and go into the world of PR. I kind of did it kicking and screaming in a way. But I went into the fields that I felt good about. One was water and one was camping. And camping, I just can't think of anything more wholesome than that.
Mm-hmm.
Camping. I mean, there's nothing more wholesome than camping.
I
So
agree.
I feel good about that. Yeah.
Cool. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on today. This has
Thank you.
been really informative, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
What a great chat with Jeff Crider. So many insights on how campgrounds are changing and what RVers can look forward to next. But before we go, here's a quick reminder for all of you who are winterizing your campers. As the temperatures drop, mice start looking for warm places to nest, and our RVs are prime real estate. That's why I rely on Fresh Cab from Earthkind. It's botanical, rodent repellent, and smells great, but it sends mice running. I took a pouch under the sink, behind the drawers, and even in the engine bay of my van, and I've never had a single problem. So rodents, they can chew wires and upholstery. They can carry diseases, but prevention is easy when you got Fresh Cab in your corner. So don't wait. Head over to earthkind.com or your local store and pick some up before mice start to move in. Hey, thanks for watching or listening. Be sure to subscribe to our Girl Camper podcast and YouTube channel. And remember, there is no wrong way to camp like a girl. And come join us at the Go Camper website. Until next time, I'll see you around the campfire.